And here in the prairies, one of the things that we hear often is, the sight of that large open sky above waving grasses. I was recently talking with someone who had actually never been to the prairies before. He'd spent his whole life in BC, and he was just in awe of the vastness and the openness. And as much as there's the beauty, what he kept commenting on was the way that he felt when being in the prairies and as he traveled through Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And I'm hoping we can bring some of that feeling to you today as you join us. Because in addition to being awe-inspiring, grasslands are critical to life as we know it. They filter the water we drink, they prevent flooding, droughts, and erosion, and they sequester carbon. They're critical to food security as forage for livestock and wild herbivores. And they also provide homes for wildlife, including many species at risk. And if that's not enough, conserving grasslands also has a lasting impact on the health and well-being of Canadians by providing spaces for recreation and time in nature, which can improve both mental and physical health. And I haven't even touched on pollinators or carbon, but there's just way too much to fit in, and you're not here to see me, you're here to see Trevor and Tasha. So grasslands, are also the most endangered terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. That's why the Nature Conservancy of Canada has launched the Prairie Grasslands Action Plan. The Prairie Grasslands Action Plan is a bold and unprecedented initiative to rally people and communities to conserve and care for one of the world's most endangered and least protected ecosystems, Canada's iconic prairie grasslands. The Prairie Grassland Action Plan will conserve more than 500,000 hectares by 2030, not a small number. So with me today to tell you more about the importance of the unsung hero that is grasslands are Trevor Herriot, naturalist, author, and bird expert, and Tasha Hubbard, filmmaker and associate professor in the University of Alberta's Faculty of Native Studies and Department of English and Film. So I know you'll learn just as much from them as I do. To start off our evening today, Trevor, we're going to start with you. Oh, I think you're on mute, Trevor.
Okay, there we go. All right. Hi, everyone. How's that working, Christine? Good. Okay. Yes, thanks very much for the introduction, Christine. And I'm delighted to be here. I'm always delighted to do anything with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, especially around grassland. And it's a treat to be here, especially tonight, with Tasha, who is a powerful filmmaker doing such important work out there, connecting people to our history, to colonization and its legacy, and how that connects with the more than human world on the prairie. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity. I'm going to have somebody there in the background advance my slides because I can't do it from here. Let's go to the first slide and we'll get started. So we're going to talk a little bit about why grassland matters. Number one, it's because native grasslands are rare and threatened. The Nature Conservancy, I think, was one of the first organizations to really forefront the point that our grasslands, temperate grasslands, are amongst the most endangered and least protected ecosystems on the continent and perhaps on the planet. So yeah, they're rare and we don't have much left. And I'll get into a little bit of more detail about that later in terms of numbers and percentages. All right, next slide. Number two, well, if you've got rare habitat, there are rare species there that are trying to hang on and persist in those remnants of the landscape. And there are 20 or 30 bird species that depending on how you define a grassland bird, that depend on native prairie. They're what we call native grassland obligate. This is one of them, the ferruginous hawk, but there are many, many more we could be talking about today. All right, next slide. You know, what I love about grassland is that when you really get down there, it's sometimes challenging to introduce people into native grassland habitats because we're used to being kind of bowled away by the beauty of mountain landscapes, coastal landscapes, the boreal forests, which are wonderful, of course, but very easy to to love. Grassland takes a little more time, but when you get there and really spend time, you begin to see that there is so much diversity there in the landscape, which of course then turns into diversity in the life forms, the birds, the insects, the mammals and reptiles and amphibians and the fish and everything that are there. If you go through grassland areas and do enough walking over grassland, you see shifts based on, you know, the soil quality, the orientation to the sun. A hillside in the Assiniboine Valley in Winnipeg or Manitoba, you know, if it's facing the south, is going to have a totally different mix of grass species and different life than the north facing side that's facing away from the sun. And of course, there are wetlands that really enrich the diversity within our grasslands regions, especially in the prairie pothole regions that are in the moist mixed grassland and the aspen parkland. Okay, next slide, please. Number 4, well, grassland protects soil and water. I remember one time going out with a grassland agrologist. We were at some kind of a field day with a bunch of producers and conservationists together, and he was showing us with some water that he would pour out onto the land and the difference between how water percolates into soil with native grassland versus, you know, cropping land that has been cultivated. And you could right away see how erosion happens, how the water just flows off the land, doesn't percolate and erodes the soil away. Whereas in areas where there was a good cover of thatch under the grass and native grass, it soaks in, percolates very slowly into the soil. And of course, with an old growth prairie that's been there for thousands of years, the root mass under the ground is really enriching the soil, capturing carbon and holding so much diversity and life in the soil, which is where everything starts in grassland. All right, next slide, please. Which brings us to the soil storing a lot of carbon. As we know, you know, forests, of course, hold a lot of carbon as well, but most of that is above ground. In grassland, it's kind of cool because it's underground in the root systems. Researchers like Edwin Bork in the University of Alberta is doing terrific work. He's got all kinds of people working with him, studying and finding out exactly which kind of grasslands and which soils and which climates are absorbing carbon at what rate. And he's done terrific work showing us that if it's managed right, rangeland, native grassland is managed properly, it can capture and store as much carbon or more than forests, and it can outperform things like the carbon capture storage projects that some governments are pursuing. Next slide, please. Number 6, they're important because they support the livestock industry, but it's an interesting cycle because livestock keep the grassland healthy. So it supports the livestock industry, but the livestock industry on native grassland also supports keeping grassland the right side up, so it's not plowed under. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in the shift from livestock grazing on some land into cropping agriculture, which is one of the concerns. But it does, in very, very many ways, support the communities, our ranching communities in Canada. And of course, it can be bison or cattle, as long as there's a grazer there. Because as we know, all grassland needs to be grazed in a sustainable way, the right amount of grazing at the right frequency to keep it healthy and diverse. All right, next slide, please. But our grasslands, of course, also contain rich cultural heritage. I'm concerned with the word heritage. It sounds like it's something in the past, but that cultural connection for the Indigenous peoples, as Tasha will attest to here when she speaks, I'm sure, continues today, of course, and it is being extended and brought into, you know, the way people live today on land, connecting young people to our native prairie habitats. It's an important part of the history of the land, but that history is coming forward in the land-based learning systems and so on that Indigenous people continue to pursue here in the prairie regions of Canada. Next slide, please. We need places like our native grasslands around the province, around Saskatchewan and Manitoba, because everybody needs natural and diverse places that they can visit. I live in the city of Regina, and if it wasn't for the Nature Conservancy's properties, like this one here in this picture, this is quite close to Regina, the Big Valley property that's on the shores of Last Mountain Lake. If it wasn't for places like this, Prairie Hill and a few others, there would be very few places, natural areas that we could go to, because so much of the land on the prairie has been privatized and given over to cropping agriculture. So we need natural places to visit. And if you live in a prairie region of Canada, that means native grassland. All right, next slide, please. And of course, we have a responsibility to the future, not just to today, but we want to have natural areas, healthy, diverse landscapes in the prairie ecoregions of Canada for our children and our grandchildren. We know that intrinsically, but it's something that I sometimes think we are not pursuing with enough integrity and purpose. Next one, please. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the ecoregions that are in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. If you look at the Manitoba portion of this image, you can see that there's that gray tone right south of Winnipeg. That's the area that is tallgrass prairie, was originally tallgrass prairie. And then further west of that, you get that shade of sort of cerulean green, I guess you'd call it, that is the aspen parkland, which is a transition zone between the boreal regions to the north and the prairie. Then you've got a brighter green where Saskatoon and Regina are in what we call the moist mixed grassland. Below that, that gray-green tone is the mixed grassland of Canada. It goes right into Alberta. And then you get that yellow zone there, which is a really unusual kind of grassland around the Cypress Hills, crossing the border of Saskatchewan and Alberta. So let's take a look at the next slide. Oops, that slide was in the wrong spot. Yeah, we missed number 10. Okay. Yeah, at the last minute, I said a slide I wanted to pop it in. It was in the wrong place. So the 10th reason grassland matters is because other creatures than us, the more than human world, has a right to exist, has an intrinsic right to be here, alive and flourish on the planet, and to connect with its own families and communities. These little babies are burrowing owls, and I heard they had a good year down at Grasslands National Park, but you know, they've declined severely in my lifetime, just from the 1980s onward. So yeah, every creature has a right to exist. All right, let's go to the next slide and see what we get. Okay, so this is unfortunately a little blurry, but it's an image I wanted to show you of the World Wildlife Fund's plow print report. They do a report every few years that shows the loss of grasslands. So we've got Manitoba on the right, Saskatchewan on the left. The red areas show the recent loss over the last few years of grassland being plowed under. Because we're told that in Manitoba, you know, that tallgrass prairie I showed you there in that other slide, there's really less than 1% of the tallgrass prairie remaining, because it was on such rich soil. It was cultivated first and early. There are no good figures yet on the original moist mixed grass prairie in Manitoba and going into Saskatchewan. But I would guess somewhere around 15% or so remains. We are going to find out. I'm going to tell a little bit more about an inventory that's coming up. Let's take a look at the next slide here. So, you know, the Saskatchewan region really has all of those, except for tallgrass prairie. It's got the moist mixed grassland and the mixed grassland. Mixed grassland is more or less on the right of the image, but in the southwest corner of the province is where the drier mixed grassland is, and that's where most of what we've got left remains. Unfortunately, the data we have right now is a little out of date, so we don't know exactly what remains. But some of the estimates that we're looking at now say that in that southwest corner of Saskatchewan, the mixed grass prairie, that drier mixed grass prairie, there is around 33% remaining of native grassland. So that's the area that has the best numbers intact. The aspen parkland above that, above the moist mixed grass and the moist mixed grass, have probably lost the most grassland. Now, we are about to find out exactly, or have a much better idea of how much remains. This image shows, by the way, what we've lost since 1990 to 2015. This was some research using Ag Canada data. May not be perfectly accurate, but these little red dots there show grassland that was lost during that 25-year period. And we have no idea exactly how much more has been lost since then. But the good news is, next slide, please. There is a inventory coming up. I want to tell you a little bit about this. The Canadian Forage and Grassland Association got some funding to do a national grassland inventory. In the next year or two, perhaps by as early as next March, we should have a much better idea of how much of our native grassland is remaining. Let's go to the next slide. So if we want to talk about what's driving grassland loss in Canada, of course, it's things like, it's mostly agriculture, you know, although there's a little bit of erosion that happens on the edges of cities and urban areas. So subsidies, including crop insurance, favor annual cropping over grazing agriculture. It's just a reality. It seems to be the way things work in Canadian agriculture. And, you know, the government invests in a commodity export model of agriculture instead of one that's really more targeting sustainability and things like food sovereignty. And, you know, concentrating power and influence into a few agri-food multinationals around the planet means that they can manipulate markets. And that means farmers are having to pay more for the inputs that they use, the seeds, the fertilizers, the chemicals, and they're selling their goods for lower prices and to fewer competitive buyers. That puts more pressure on them to intensify their land use and to shift to annual crops rather than livestock. And that brings up the final point. With higher land prices all the time, it's becoming uneconomical to even use, you know, marginal prairie land for livestock grazing. In the past, marginal lands were always good for just growing grass, and you could count on, you know, making some money as a rancher there or as a mixed farmer. But now with the shift in prices, it's just become another situation where producers are feeling, you know, some pressure when a rancher, for example, sells his land. It will be often sold to a cropping farmer who will then cultivate the native grassland and start growing canola or grains on it. The privatization of land as well in Saskatchewan is public land is also an issue because we often lose native grassland when that happens. Okay, let's go to number 17. Skip a couple forward because we're running out of time here. So NCC, of course, is doing wonderful work in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan, working with local communities, with livestock producers, grazing groups, Indigenous communities, industry, and government, keeping grasslands healthy and diverse as best they can. By building relationships with Indigenous and non-Indigenous land managers in grassland regions, NCC is helping Canada hold on to its last remnants of native prairie. About a year ago, as Christine mentioned in the introduction, NCC in Manitoba launched its 5-year grassland campaign. They did it with the purchase of one of the largest remnants of tall grass prairie left in Canada at what's called the Lake Ranch in the Interlake District. Now, a lot of the funding, of course, came from federal government, but private donations were critical in making this purchase happen. As well, the Manitoba region works with the Association of Manitoba Community Pastors to monitor and improve the biodiversity of prairie grasslands in priority areas. Next slide, please. So in Saskatchewan, NCC has 8 key grassland properties, including its flagship site at Old Man on His Back in that southwest mixed grassland area where there's more than 5,000 hectares of mixed grass prairie. Next slide, please. They've done good work in Saskatchewan with Indigenous people. Here's an example. This is a photo from a YouTube video showing the release of bison at Key Lake First Nation. NCC worked closely with them to help them establish 40 Plains bison there on their reserve in eastern Saskatchewan Treaty 4 territory. And at Old Man on His Back, NCC for 20 years has been managing a herd of 50 bison. And they do it with the support and cooperation of an Indigenous advisory group. In Saskatchewan, NCC also works with some of the grazing organizations now managing the former federal community pastures. I think I'm probably running out of time. I was going to mention something that Matthew Braun was doing in a webinar, but let's move on to close up. So with the final slide, I just want to say, you know, so sure, all prairie conservation work is up against the large forces in agribusiness for sure. And the colonial extractive economy, agricultural economy that we've established here, which goes back hundreds of years. But NCC and its faithful donors, working with Indigenous people, working with ranchers and government agencies, are doing some of the most important work on the continent, protecting our last remaining islands of native grass and helping the public understand why native prairie matters. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Trevor. It's always an easy connection to see why you're a favorite amongst our staff and our supporters. So thank you so much. If you have questions, I know we always learn from Trevor. If you have things that are popping up in your mind and you want to bring it up, please enter it into the Q&A section. And if you have questions for Tasha, enter those in as well. And we'll be trying to get through to those at the end of the hour. So thank you, Trevor. Tasha, off to you, please, and thank you.
Good to unmute before you present. So, Tansei, my name is Tasha Hubbard. I'm a member of the Papixis First Nation in Treaty 4, and my dad is from Thunderchild First Nation in Treaty 6. Although my mother's people originally were from Zagame, and my dad's people were originally from Stony Knoll, which is just north of Saskatoon. And, I want to start just with a bit of a personal story. I grew up in southern Saskatchewan on a farm. I was adopted out as a baby, and, my mother's people, got the Homestead Awards and the Heritage Awards for their home and farm. And I grew up just north of what was known as the Big Butte, and, fell in love with Grasslands. And I live in Edmonton, and I don't like it because I can't see. I tell people that all the time. I can't see. There's too many trees, and I don't know how much longer I'll last, because I miss the grass. I miss that space, and I'm thankful to my grandpa for taking me out as a little girl. And he told me a story before he passed away, that he tilled up some natural prairie that was on the homestead farm, and did it, not too long ago, probably in that span of time, Trevor, that you outlined. And he told me, at the age of 93, that it was his life's regret, because he realized what the value, and not financial value, but what the value in the sense of the beings that it hosted, the history that it held, that he had taken that. And I think about that a lot, and I see some of the, that red just like hit me in my heart. I just feel that so much, because it is these spaces, these places that hold so much for us as Indigenous people. So I'm going to ask for the next slide. I think a lot about what Trevor talks about in the more than human, and people say non-human, or animals, different phrases, but I like more than human as well. And I think one of the things that is setting us on a path that is not sustainable is the hierarchical thinking, right? That human beings are at the top, and that all the other beings that exist in this place are there at our disposal, and therefore become disposable. And I want us to start thinking about us as part of the ecosystem, meaning that, as Trevor said, the other beings that we share this land with have a right to exist, have been here longer than we've been here, are wiser than we are. In Indigenous belief, we're the pitiful ones, because ultimately we are the ones that need the most in order to survive. And I think about that, and often we'll see, the big moose and elk and deer, but I happen to really like the prairie dogs and the small beings as well, because they move through this world as well. So next slide. This, again, prairie crocus, next time you see a crocus in the spring, I'm sure, people had the same experience I did. That first crocus was so exciting because you knew spring was coming. And I included an image of this because, the crocuses are, for us, a symbol of birth and renewal. And in our way, the name for the crocus is translated as buffalo belly button. And it's the place where buffalo are born. And that's why, when you have natural prairie and you see those crocuses, that crocus to us, when we saw that was the time for us to start to begin our cycles of renewal on this land. Next slide. So this is a buffalo ribstone that's in Herschel, Saskatchewan, in a place called Ancient Echoes. There's many of these. There were many more. I say many, there's several is probably the better word. But there were many at one time. And of course, with the tilling up of natural prairie, a lot of these sites have been lost, as you saw an image in Trevor's as well. I, as an adoptee, as someone who was adopted out and grew up on the farm, I met my family when I was 16. And, I spent my late teens and 20s trying to reconnect to who I was as an Indigenous person. And, I met my family, and I went back to my reserves, and, that was definitely part of that path. But the turning point for me was actually being taken to see one of these buffalo ribstones. And, it was transformative. I went with elders. We acknowledged these stones as our grandfathers. These were places that we came to have ceremony, including those ceremonies of renewal, where we sang to the beings that we shared the land with. And, I had a path set for myself. I was in academia at the time. I knew what I was going to study. I knew what my path was, and visiting that stone changed everything for me, because it started me on a path of thinking about, all of those beings, including the buffalo, and, what that did to us as Indigenous people to have them taken from us, and, to have the world change so drastically. And I started to think about the grief that we carried as Indigenous people, but also the potential that these places have to help us reconnect to who we are in the face of that ongoing colonization. So I wanted to acknowledge these because it is on those grasslands that are left that we still have these sacred sites. And, I get sad about the place. I hear about the ones that were, and then the grass got cultivated and the stones got distributed, and who knows, right? Who knows where they are? So many that were dismantled and destroyed. And so the ones that we still can go visit are on these intact grassland ecosystems. Next slide. This is a buffalo ribstone that was just south of the border at a place called Cree Crossing, where it was our north-south corridor, where we would go south down to the Missouri River to follow the buffalo, to walk behind them. And this stone was taken off of its land and put in the town of Malta, Montana. But the stone didn't like it. The old timers talk about it moving and scaring them and rumbling. So it got moved to the side of the highway, and it's confined in this very strong fence, so it won't go anywhere. But I think a lot of the work that I'm doing is to think about how do we dismantle those fences, and how do we recover not just ourselves as Indigenous people, but the other beings that are threatened because of the threat to grasslands. Next slide, please. So my work and my newest film is about the buffalo, and it's called Singing Back the Buffalo. And it tells the story of how Indigenous people are attempting to bring buffalo back because of our obligations to them, because we understand them as our relatives, we understand them as our family, and that, we are, a group of us across the continent are, really committing to bringing them back to revitalize us, but to also revitalize the land. And as Trevor said, the way buffalo move through the grassland ecosystem is really about renewal, and the way they graze and what they leave behind. They're the best fertilizers. How many beings rely on the buffalo and work. And I always think of the buffalo and the land and the beings and everyone working together and helping each other, to live a good life. And that's what we're meant to do. Next slide, please. So part of what I do is think about buffalo consciousness, but I think, buffalo and grasslands ecosystems work hand in hand. And so, when we think about buffalo consciousness, what's inherent in that really is grasslands consciousness as well, in terms of like what that significance is for us. And so buffalo consciousness, when the people awake and connect to our relative, the buffalo, it's the coming back of that buffalo spirit amongst the people. And that's from one of my teachers, Leroy Little Bear, who has shifted the way I think a lot about the land and about who lives on it. Next, please. This is just a still from my newest film that'll come in 2024. It's a black and white photo from a friend of mine, Joanne Janelle, who is a beautiful photographer and also proponent of grasslands. And we got her permission to colorize it. It's a black and white photo. And then you see the little crocuses there as well. We wanted to acknowledge them. Okay, we can keep going. Oh, so I think I have a couple more minutes. What am I at? I timed myself because I can talk. So I'm at 11 minutes. If someone can tell me, I think I have a few more left.
Yes, Tasha, you still have another 4 minutes.
Great. Okay. Can we go back then to the previous one? Perfect. So I guess when I just want to, leave you some of these thoughts around, what the potential is for these places. I think that, as Indigenous people and, the impacts that have happened, many of our youth are growing up in urban centers. Many of our youth are growing up in, with a small sort of sphere of where they move. And, being able to come out to these grassland spaces, being able to walk on the land. One of the things that I've learned from Leroy and other very wise and beautiful teachers is that we are a part of the land, and it remembers us, and it wants people it wants to feel our footsteps on it again. And so a lot of the work that many of us are doing, in land education programs, camps, visits, tours, things like that, is bringing our Indigenous youth to grassland ecosystems and to, undo that thinking. Because I think, what we're all of us collectively are socialized to think is, and Trevor touched on this, is grasslands as empty. And it's just, seen as empty land, and, oh, there's some cattle, and that's kind of it. Maybe some horses, that's kind of, the scenes that we grow up with. And, the time that I've been able to spend, in these ecosystems, just to sit and listen and observe, has really given me the gifts that I have today in terms of being a filmmaker, and my ability to observe and my ability to hear and see. It's because of all of the beautiful subtleties and, all of the life that exists in these grassland spaces. And, I just feel so grateful that they still are here. What we do, as heart-wrenching as it is to see what's been lost, at the same time, it's not all lost, right? There's still these places and spaces, and they are just so important to us. They are really symbols of hope. They're symbols of reawakening for us. They're symbols of how we become collectively better versions of ourselves, is being able to work together to protect these places that hold so much significance to us. So I just wanted to say that, and I think I can stop there and we can see if there's questions.
Thanks, Tasha. That was amazing. And yeah, I think you're right. Just all being better versions of ourselves. We have had a couple of questions that have been submitted, so we're going to jump into that. I'm going to be joined now by Carrie Hamill, who's our Director of Conservation here in Manitoba. And so if you've been wondering why Carrie's name is under, it's because he's on his way. So we're happy to have Carrie join us. We have a couple of questions submitted already, and we're going to get to those. And if you have any more, please enter them. So question number 1, we're going to get Carrie to answer for us here. Can smaller grasslands, such as pastures or sloughs or other water features, be preserved before a farm is sold off, and how?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thanks to the presenters. That was excellent. And to hang around people that love prairies and grasslands and everything about them is just, yeah, it's super exciting. So for this question, yeah, there's a tool, a conservation agreement or covenant that is possible depending on the land. It's useful for private land, at least, where certain areas that are important ecologically can be conserved forever. It goes on title. It's negotiated with a group like Nature Conservancy Canada or other partners across the landscape in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And if the land qualifies for that and that goes on title, then even if you sell your land, you'll have that peace of mind of knowing that those special areas of the property will be forever kept that way. The conservation organization will be a partner with future landowners as well.
Great, thank you, Carrie. We had one, Trevor, that I think might be good for you to answer. It was submitted a little bit earlier. It says, the extreme part of southwestern Manitoba has some wonderful grasslands. In recent years, it seems to me as though there has been a decline in numbers of birds and bird species in the area. My observations tell me that the grasslands seem to be under stress due to other plants taking over the area. Plants such as clover, alfalfa, and other plants and brush. This seems to be less than desirable, and I'm wondering if anything can be done to prevent that from happening, or is it best just to let nature take its course?
Well, there's a couple of points there. Certainly, it's not just habitat loss that is causing the decline of biodiversity in grassland, it's habitat degradation as well. And so things like introduced and invasive species are probably a prime driver of habitat degradation. And they can, not in all cases, but for some birds, I think the research shows they can create sort of sink habitats where they attract birds because it looks like good grassland, but for whatever reason, the structure of the grass, the opportunities for predators, changes in the sort of the food availability makes it harder for them to reproduce and recruit enough people back into their populations. So over time, you can see a decline. So this question might be coming from a birder or somebody who just goes to grassland, has been noticing there's fewer of the species, the barred sparrows or the chestnut colored longspurs over time. So yeah, that's definitely happening. Now the other question is what can we do to help? Well managed grazing with bison and cattle certainly can help. There are some ways of controlling invasive species, and we need to work on things, especially things like leafy spurge, where it's a problem. Brome grass getting in at too high a rate can be a problem. So yeah, there's things that can be done, but it takes resources. And I know the Nature Conservancy has done some of that work on its big grasslands, at least in Saskatchewan for sure. Thanks for that question.
Oh, that was my turn to be on mute. Thanks, Trevor. One more, Carrie, here, we're gonna go with you. Road allowances are often being worked over, and in some cases, those that were designated as conservation corridors. Is there anything that can be done to protect those too? Are those smaller pieces of value as habitat?
Yeah, and happy to take a shot at that. I suspect other panelists can speak to this as well. There's growing evidence that having natural habitats, even small strips close to cropland, can help increase pollination of crops, increase yield, slow down soil erosion, slow down flooding. It's we often think big in conservation about conserving those biggest and best places, and that's important. But there's lots of really special smaller places too, even undeveloped road allowances in between fields. In terms of broader, systematic conservation of them, I'm not aware of a program. Maybe you are in Saskatchewan, Trevor.
Yeah,
there are some local watershed districts in Manitoba that have tried. But yeah, go ahead, Trevor.
Yeah, actually, there is a really good example of what can be done at a local level. The folks that belong to the Yellowhead Birding Trail Society in sort of east central Saskatchewan around Yorkton Saltcoats have just over the last year introduced a program where they honor and celebrate road allowances in, I think it's up to 4 rural municipalities now that are protecting their road allowances with habitat. And they're doing really great work. They go out there, they have walks, they celebrate them, gets on social media, and it's a terrific program. So, I think that kind of local level work is probably the best way to address these issues.
Thank you both. Tasha, this is a question for you. How can conservation meaningfully contribute to reconciliation?
Well, in terms of reconciliation, it's such an interesting concept, right? And I always just remind people to always include the truth and think of the histories and stories that have to be told and haven't been told. So I always preface whatever I talk about reconciliation with we're still in this ongoing notion of truth. But I do feel that in terms of conservation, so a lot of our people still practice our traditions and our have our ways of healing and medicinal plants, things like that, and so in terms of the sacred sites and ceremonies, I mean that's absolutely part of it, given those things were outlawed for so long, and we're in that process of recovery, so there's that. But there is that conservation, being open to having us, as I say, I talked about having our children be able to come and walk on that land again, and part of that is learning. Part of that is learning those those medicines and plants that still exist and that are there. I often think a lot about the buffalo as reconciliation. The buffalo is justice. Because of their eradication and being able to have them come. One of the they are incredible conservationists. The elders that I work with always talk about that the buffalo are the best conservationists because they carry seeds, they aerate the soil, they graze in that really healthy way that Trevor referenced, that improves soil health. They're fertilizing, their snot, supports all these little microorganisms that are necessary. The biodiversity, those beautiful, cute little burrowing owls, they need bison dung to flourish, because the mamas line the dung, their dens with the dung, and the dung has this incredible property of being able to retain water, and then release the water to act as a temperature control. So it keeps the temperature consistent. And it also supplies all these little crawlies so that the little chicks can learn to hunt and do things like that. So, there's so many stories. I've learned a lot from Wes Olson and the late Narcissus Blood and many others. So, I think it's all that hand in hand of access, but also, providing that space for all of that diversity to flourish. because we do see that, you know, as our relatives, as we come back and as we become who we're meant to be. That's one of the main teachings. You know, people talk about all our relatives, and they often just think, oh, who we're related to, you know, our aunties and uncles and cousins, but it's much more deep than that. It's really all of those beings that share the land with us. We are all related. We need each other to be on this land and to survive long into the future. And you know, grasslands, conservation, and reconciliation and justice, you know, are a big part of that.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a question, Trevor and Tasha, I'd actually like to hear from both of you. The comment says, thank you for a great presentation. With everything considered, what if I feel like I'm just one person and I cannot make a difference? Trevor, what's your answer?
Okay, I'm going to try to extend some of what Tasha was just saying to answer that question of what an individual can do, because I think on questions of what we're calling reconciliation, and we know we really haven't begun even in Canada to really reconcile, that, you know, the onus is on us as settler descended people to figure out how to do this, and not to put the pressure on Indigenous people to tell us how to do it. We certainly work with them. So as individuals, what can we do? Well, get to know Indigenous people where you live on the prairie. Learn a little bit about traditional ecological knowledge from First Nations people. I think the conservation movement has, and I've been as guilty as anyone and involved in this movement for a long time, has barely begun to really work on an equal level and an equal basis with First Nations and Métis people on the prairie to address these questions. So much more work has to be done. I've been to so many conferences now where we think we're doing a good job because out of the 20 speakers that are up there, there might be 2 or 3 that are Indigenous. It's got to be more equal than that. I think that there's tremendous work ahead of us where we really recognize the wisdom in traditional ecological knowledge that has maintained the health of the grassland for thousands of years with fire and bison management. That came from First Nations people. It didn't just happen. It was because they were moving the bison around and using fire to do that and hunting them in the right way. There's so much more to be learned than just those basic facts. And I think until we all start to really connect with First Nations and Métis people on the prairie, we're going to continue to struggle and continue to impose a kind of a colonial oversight of the land and it's the way we use it over time. So we need to start to get to know each other and cross those bridges.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Tasha.
Yeah, you know, I'm so glad, whoever you are, that you asked that question, because I think it gets overwhelming, you know, when we think about what needs to be done and how can one person, and so, but there are things we can do as individuals, right? And some of that is, you know, being on that education path and learning, as Trevor said, finding ways to support. I mean, there's the you know, there's the treaty land sharing network that's really interesting. There's the support, and one of the reasons, I was so happy to come and support tonight is because, you know, the NCC and the work that has been done to start that path of reconciliation is happening, because in the past, you know, conservation organizations definitely weren't there, and in some places did harm. And so the shift that is happening is really important. And I think, you know, for individuals, it's supporting those efforts that are in existence. You know, there's work that's being done through the Buffalo Treaty, which is some of the work that I've been supporting. It came out of Blackfoot territory, and it really was it's a treaty that now has 50 signatories, as far south as the Apache in Texas, and is soon to be far north as up in northern Alberta. So 50 Indigenous nations have signed on for this Buffalo Treaty in order to support the buffalo. But as I said, you can't, you know, the buffalo and grasslands go hand in hand. And so, you know, finding, you know, different initiatives and supporting, I think having difficult conversations. I mean, that talk I had with my grandpa, we were having it not just as grandfather, granddaughter, we were having it as white farmer, Indigenous woman. And you know, it was a hard conversation to have. There were tears. There were sometimes misunderstandings. There were these uncomfortable pauses, you know, and you know, we worked through it. We kept talking, and you know, ultimately, you know, it was an important conversation to have that we both learned from. And you know, he came to terms with things, and I share that story a lot because I think, you know, in his 90s, people, if they're blessed to live that long and, you know, still have their minds intact and all of, you know, that was his regret, was that tilling. And I worry about people who are still in the process of doing that. You know, let's try to stop that now. Let's try to intervene and give people a different path now, to prevent that.
Yeah, thank you. Carrie, we have one for you here. It's clear that grasslands are very much at risk, and we need drastic measures to save the remainder of it. But NCC can only secure or purchase so much land, since not everyone in Canada is an environmental enthusiast. What is your approach to being successful?
Oh, goodness. And I don't think that's just a question for me, from the other panelists.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I've had the honor of working at Nature Conservancy of Canada for about 16 years, and we do have tons of support. And I think a big part of it is raising awareness of grasslands and how special they are, but not just for the grasslands, for people. And we're talking about that lots here tonight. But yeah, there is more to conservation than NCC owning land or accepting a donation of land. There's the individual actions that communities take and individuals. And I like what Trevor mentioned earlier about celebrating municipalities that conserve road allowances and just celebrating people that do this work in their everyday lives. I think that makes a big impact.
Great. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, I think we are coming towards our end of time here. So I do know we had a couple more questions, but I think we're going to try to get to those through email, and we'll sort of figure out how we're going to respond to those ones. I really want to send out a giant thank you to Trevor and Tasha for your presentations, and for all of answering all of our questions, to Carrie for joining us here for a little bit of NCC perspective as well. And most of all, we want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. You know, it's one thing for a bunch of people to be in conservation and to care, but we need all of you to also be caring and to bringing it together and working together to really make a difference. So thank you so much for all that you do. We hope to see you soon. If you'd like to learn more, please visit the website on the site of prairiegrasslands.ca. And have a great evening. Thank you so much.